They laughed when the deaf bride fell. Her white dress brushed against the dirt, her bouquet scattered across the ground, and their laughter echoed through the street like gunfire. She couldn't hear them, but she could feel it. The shame, the mockery, the sound of cruel hearts, and then silence. One man stood up from the shadows near the saloon doors, his hat low, his eyes cold as steel. The crowd stopped laughing when he spoke. I've never seen greater cowardice than this. That man was Silas Kane, once the fastest gun in 3 territories. Now, a stranger in a town that forgot what honor meant. He didn't come for blood that day. He came to remind them what it means to be human. Because sometimes the loudest voice in a cruel world belongs to the one who says nothing at all. Mary Lou Turner had never known a world without silence. Since a fire in her father's barn years ago, she lived in quiet, a kind of stillness that made her feel both safe and alone. She learned to read lips, to smile when others smiled, to laugh when it seemed right. But inside, every word she saw felt like a memory of a sound she could no longer remember. That morning, the town of Red Creek was painted gold by the rising sun. Dust swirled around the chapel steps where townsfolk gathered in their Sunday best. The preacher wiped sweat from his brow, fanning himself with his worn hat. Everyone was whispering, the kind of whispers people think a deaf woman can't see. Mary Lou stood in front of the mirror in a back room of the church, smoothing the creases of her simple white dress. The lace was old, handed down from her mother. She couldn't hear the clatter of the organ warming up or the boots scuffing against the floorboards outside. All she could see was her own reflection, the nervous rise and fall of her breath. Eli Turner, her soon-to-be husband, was outside shaking hands, smiling that wide smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was a rancher, proud, loud, and the kind of man who liked the sound of his own voice. To him, marrying Mary Lou was an act of charity, and he made sure the whole town knew it. Inside, Mary Lou's friend pinned a flower to her hair. "You look beautiful," she mouthed slowly. Mary Lou nodded and smiled, pretending not to notice the pity in her eyes. She picked up her bouquet, wild daisies from the field behind the barn, and took one last look in the mirror. For a moment she thought she saw her mother standing behind her, smiling through the veil of memory. Then the doors opened. The church fell into a hush as she stepped into the sunlight. Her heart pounded in her chest, though she couldn't hear the music that played. All she saw were faces, some kind, some cruel, some just curious. Children leaned forward in the pews, whispering behind their hands. She walked slowly down the aisle, counting her steps. 1, 2, 3. Her world was all rhythm and breath. At the altar, Eli waved with that same rehearsed grin. The preacher spoke, his lips moving in practiced rhythm. She watched closely, catching what words she could: faith, love, forever. Then it happened. As she reached for Eli's hand, her foot caught the edge of her dress. The world tilted. The bouquet slipped from her fingers, petals scattering across the dusty floor. She fell to her knees before the entire town, and though she could not hear it, the laughter came. It rippled through the pews like a cruel wind. Men covered their mouths, women smirked behind fans. Even Eli chuckled under his breath, embarrassed by her clumsiness. Mary Lou felt her cheeks burn. Her eyes darted from face to face, mouths twisting into smiles she couldn't hear, but could feel deep in her bones. From the back of the church, a shadow moved, boots on wood. A heart lifted, eyes sharp as thunderclouds. Silas Kane. He'd been sitting in the last pew, hands folded, saying nothing. But now the laughter died as his voice, low and steady, cut through the air. "I've never seen greater cowardice than this." And in that single moment the town remembered what shame sounded like. Silas Kane's words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired. No one dared move. The sunlight from the high windows cut across the pews, lighting faces that suddenly seemed much smaller, much weaker. Mary Lou stayed on her knees, the edges of her dress torn and dusted brown. Her fingers trembled as she gathered the wilted flowers one by one. She didn't understand what had happened, only that the room felt colder now. Eli stood stiff beside the preacher, his jaw tight. He hated being embarrassed. He hated being challenged even more. He looked toward Silas, eyes full of pride and anger. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Eli barked, his voice loud enough to rattle the stained-glass windows. Silas didn't answer right away. He stepped forward slowly, the boards creaking under his boots. His hat shadowed half his face, but his eyes were steady, the kind of eyes that had seen too much war, too much death, and carried the weight of both. "The man," Silas said finally, "who remembers what it means to have a heart." The preacher tried to calm them, raising a trembling hand. "This is a house of God, gentlemen." Silas glanced at him, then back to the crowd. "Then maybe God ought to hear what kind of laughter fills his house." A woman in the second row looked down at her lap, ashamed. The blacksmith beside her shifted uncomfortably. The town drunk crossed his arms, pretending not to care. But deep down every one of them felt the sting of the truth. Mary Lou rose slowly, bouquet clutched to her chest. She didn't look at Eli. She didn't look at anyone. She turned toward the door, her face pale, her steps quick and uneven. Outside, the light hit her like a wave, warm, harsh, blinding. She blinked back tears she couldn't hear fall. The world spun around her in silence, and all she wanted was to be far, far from the soundless cruelty of Red Creek. Silas followed her with his eyes as she walked down the steps, the veil fluttering in the wind. Something in him stirred, something he hadn't felt in years. He knew that kind of loneliness, the kind that doesn't need sound to scream. Eli muttered something under his breath, stepping toward Silas. "You think you're some kind of hero. Maybe you ought to mind your own damn business." Silas turned his head, his voice low and even. "You made her your business when you made her a fool." Eli's hand twitched toward the holster at his side, not for a draw, but for the show of it. The kind of move cowards make to feel big. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "Don't," he said softly, "not in front of her." The sheriff, old Tom Hayes, rose from the back pew. "That's enough, Eli," he said, voice gravelly but firm. "You're lucky Silas here is talking instead of shooting." Eli sneered, but he knew better than to push his luck. He brushed past Silas, muttering curses as he went after Mary Lou. Silas exhaled, long and heavy. He set his hat back down on his head and turned toward the door. As he stepped outside, the town's laughter was gone. In its place, whispers. But not the cruel kind. The kind that carried guilt and a strange, unfamiliar respect. He looked toward the horizon, where the bride's white dress was a ghostly shape moving across the road. He watched her walk, her figure small against the burning sun. And for the first time in years, Silas Kane followed someone not because of bounty, but because something in his chest told him she needed to be found. That night, the town would remember two things, the way she fell and the way he stood. Silas Kane rode slow, following the trail of torn lace that the wind carried through the brush. He'd seen women cry before, wives over dead husbands, mothers over lost sons, but something about the way Mary Lou had walked away broke him in a place he thought long dead. He found her by the river. She was sitting on a rock, her wedding veil tangled in her fingers, eyes fixed on the moon's reflection on the water. Her lips moved faintly, like she was talking to someone only she could hear. Silas dismounted, boots sinking into the sand. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, hat in hand, watching her shoulders tremble. Then, quietly, he stepped forward and placed her bouquet beside her. She turned, startled, eyes red and tired. Her lips parted, no sound came. He knelt in front of her, tracing a few words in the dirt with his finger. "You all right?" Mary Lou looked at the letters, then shook her head slowly. She picked up a small stick and wrote beside his words, "Why do you help me?" Silas stared at the ground for a moment, then wrote because nobody else would. The river carried their silence downstream. Above them, stars were waking. She studied him, her eyes searching his face. There was something familiar in the scar that ran along his jaw, and the way his hand trembled when he brushed the dust from his coat. She pointed to it. "Gunfight?" she wrote. He nodded once. Then, with a deep breath, he wrote back, "Many. Too many." For a long time, neither of them moved. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of smoke from some far-off campfire. Finally, she wrote again, "I lost my hearing in one." Silas froze. His hand tightened on his knee. He could almost hear the old noise, the thunder of pistols, the screams, the crack of burning wood. He swallowed hard, his voice low, rough as gravel. "Where?" She read his lips, then pointed east, toward a ridge faintly visible in the moonlight, near the Miller barn. 6 years ago. The world seemed to tilt. Silas's breath caught in his throat. That was the place. The fire he'd started without meaning to, chasing a bandit through the fields. A bullet meant for him had hit the barn lantern, and everything had gone up in flames. He looked away, his jaw trembling. "That was me." She didn't understand the words, but she saw the pain in his face, the way his shoulders sagged as if the truth itself had weight. She waited while he knelt and wrote again, slowly, each word like a confession. "It was my gun that caused it." Mary Lou's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away. She took the stick from his hand, wrote one word, then pushed it gently back to him. "Accident." He stared at the letters until they blurred. Then, with a shaky breath, he nodded. They sat together until the moon climbed high, saying nothing more. The sound of the river filled the spaces where words could not. When she finally stood, Silas offered his hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her grip was small, steady, certain. He led his horse closer, lifted her up into the saddle. Together they rode through the silver light, two shadows against the desert. And as they disappeared into the dark, Silas Kane felt something stir in his chest again. Something like the sound of forgiveness, soft and steady, even in a world that had long forgotten how to listen. The morning came soft and golden, spreading across the plains like a quiet promise. Mary Lou woke by the river, her veil folded beside her, the air cool against her skin. Silas was already awake, tending a small fire. He looked different in daylight, less like a gunslinger, more like a man trying to forget he'd ever been one. She watched him pour coffee, the steam rising between them. He caught her gaze and smiled faintly before handing her a cup. She didn't drink, just held it close for warmth. He wrote in the dirt again, "You can go back if you want." She stared at the words, then shook her head. The thought of returning to that town, to those faces that laughed, made her chest tighten. She reached for the stick, wrote, "No home there anymore." Silas nodded. "Then we'll ride." He pointed west toward the open land where the horizon shimmered like glass. She didn't know where he meant to go, but the thought of anywhere else was enough. They packed slowly, in silence that wasn't heavy anymore. It felt honest. When they rode back through the edge of Red Creek later that day, the townsfolk stopped what they were doing. No one laughed this time. Children stared from the doorways. Men tipped their hats out of respect, or maybe guilt. Eli Turner was standing outside the saloon. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt half-buttoned, a bottle in his hand. When he saw them, he straightened, rage and shame mixing like dust and whiskey. "So that's it?" he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You run off with the first gun hand that plays the hero?" Mary Lou stopped her horse. She didn't look down at him. Her face was calm, her posture proud. She reached for the stick tied to her saddle and began to write in the dirt of the road. The crowd leaned closer. When she finished, the message was short and clean. A man's worth is seen in how he treats the weak. Eli es yav tightened. "You think you're better than me?" Silas dismounted, his shadow long and dark across the street. "She doesn't have to think it," he said quietly. "Everyone can see it." The sheriff appeared in the doorway of his office, hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Let it go, Eli," he said. "Ain't no honor left in fighting what you already lost." Eli spat in the dust, but said nothing more. He turned and pushed back to the saloon doors, the sound of them swinging fading into the warm morning. Mary Lou's eyes followed him for a moment, then drifted toward the church steeple in the distance. The wind carried faint music, someone playing the organ softly, maybe out of guilt, maybe prayer. She didn't need to hear the notes to feel them. Silas touched the brim of his hat, a quiet gesture that meant it was time to move on. They rode out of town as the sun climbed higher, their silhouettes stretching behind them. The people of Red Creek watched until they vanished over the ridge, and for the first time no one whispered. That night, as the stars bloomed above the desert, Silas built a fire and set out 2 bedrolls. Mary Lou sat close, her hair catching the light like spun copper. He handed her a small piece of paper, words written in uneven scrawl. "You're stronger than any of them ever knew." She looked at him, smiled softly, then wrote her a reply on the same page. "You saw it first." The fire cracked between them. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, and for the first time since the wedding, Mary Lou closed her eyes and felt peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from silence, but from finally being understood. And as the wind moved through the canyons, carrying the scent of sage and smoke, the world seemed to breathe again. 2 souls, bound not by sound or words, but by the quiet courage of the heart. The river glimmered like glass under the noonday sun. Mary Lou and Silas rode side by side through the valley, the horses' hooves stirring up slow clouds of dust. Days had passed since they had left Red Creek behind, and the silence between them had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind that spoke in looks and small smiles, in trust that didn't need words. They stopped near a canyon where the wind sang low through the stones. Silas built a small camp, his movements practiced, patient. Mary Lou gathered water from the stream, her dress faded from travel, but her eyes alive with something new, freedom. When they sat down to eat, Silas wrote a few words in the dirt. "You plan to keep riding?" She thought for a moment, then took the stick and answered, "Until I find a place where silence ain't shame." He looked at her handwriting, simple and firm, and felt something stir in his chest, a sense that maybe he'd been looking for the same thing all along. The afternoon drifted by in warmth and quiet wind. Silas leaned back against a rock, hat tipped low, watching the clouds stretch across the wide blue. Mary Lou was sketching shapes in the sand, flowers, birds, the outlines of mountains. He caught himself smiling. Later, as dusk settled, they rode again, heading toward a settlement at the edge of the desert. The town was small, 6 wooden buildings and a windmill that squeaked with every turn. The people there looked worn but kind, the sort who'd seen too much to judge anyone by rumors. They stopped at the general store for supplies. The shopkeeper, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, watched as Mary Lou traced her order on a piece of paper. The woman smiled softly. "You've come far," she said. Mary Lou nodded. Silas handed over the coins, his voice steady. "We're just passing through." But the woman looked between them and shook her head gently. "Maybe not. Folks don't look at each other like that if they're just passing through." Outside, the sky was deepening into gold and violet. They found an old barn at the edge of town and made camp there for the night. The air smelled of hay and summer rain. Mary Lou sat near the doorway, watching the first stars appear. Silas joined her, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. He took out a small harmonica from his coat pocket, turning it over in his hands. He hesitated, then raised it to his lips. The notes were soft, low, full of ache. Mary Lou couldn't hear them, but she could see them in the way his body moved, in the rhythm of his breath. She closed her eyes, feeling the vibration in the air, the pulse of sound she couldn't name but somehow understood. When he finished, he looked at her, half embarrassed. "Ain't played that in years," he murmured. She smiled and reached for his hand, tracing letters on his palm. "I heard it anyway." He looked down at her words, and a small, broken laugh escaped his throat. For the first time, it wasn't bitter, it was hope. That night, Silas dreamed of the fire again, the one that had taken her hearing, his peace, and everything good he once believed about himself. But this time, when the flames rose around him, he saw her standing there, calm and bright, and the fire turned to light. When he woke, dawn was breaking through the cracks in the barn. Mary Lou was already up, brushing the dust from her skirt, the morning sun painting her in gold. She looked back at him and smiled. He stood, adjusted his hat, and for the first time in years felt ready to face the day. As they rode out, the wind carried a faint sound across the valley, the slow creak of the windmill, the soft whine of rope, and something else too, something deeper. It wasn't the sound of the world, but the sound of peace finding its way into two broken souls. And as the trail disappeared behind him, Silas knew he'd finally found what he'd been chasing all his life, not redemption through a gun, but through a woman who couldn't hear a thing. And somehow heard him better than anyone ever had. You said the days turned softer as they traveled west. The land opened wide, full of golden grass and long shadows that moved with the wind. Each night they camped beneath the same endless sky, and each morning the silence between them grew warmer, filled with small gestures that said more than words ever could. Silas taught her to ride without fear, showing her how to feel the rhythm of the horse through her knees, how to sense direction by the tilt of the sun. She laughed sometimes, silently but bright enough that he could almost hear it. That laughter stayed with him, a sound inside his chest he didn't want to lose. They came upon a small homestead by the foothills, an old cabin with broken shutters and a half-collapsed barn. It wasn't much, but it had walls, a well, and a view of the valley that looked like peace. Silas reined in his horse and nodded toward it. "Could fix it up," he said softly, knowing she'd read his lips. Mary Lou slid from the saddle, her boots touching the ground with a sure step. She looked around, walked toward the porch, and ran her hand across the worn wood. It felt like a heartbeat, tired but steady. She turned back and smiled. They stayed. The days began to take shape. Silas mended fences, fixed the roof, cleared brush. Mary Lou planted a small garden near the well. She worked quietly, humming to herself out of habit, though she couldn't hear the sound. Silas often stopped to watch her, the sunlight turning her hair the color of wheat. In the evenings they sat by the fire. Sometimes he played the harmonica again, slow and careful, and she'd close her eyes, feeling the pulse of the melody through the ground. Other nights she'd write stories in her small notebook, bits of memory, words she'd never spoken aloud. He'd read them by the firelight, each one unfolding like a prayer. But peace never stays long for men like Silas. Word of him had spread, rumors about a gunslinger hiding out, about unfinished scores. One afternoon a rider appeared on the ridge, watching the cabin. Silas saw the glint of a rifle barrel in the sun and knew trouble had found him again. He saddled his horse quietly, told Mary Lou he needed to ride into town for supplies. She saw the tightness in his jaw, the old heaviness in his shoulders. She wrote quickly on a scrap of paper, "Don't run from ghosts." He took the note, folded once, then slipped it into his coat pocket. "I ain't running," he said. "Just settling things before they find us." She didn't try to stop him. She only reached for his hand and pressed it to her heart. He felt it, the steady, strong rhythm, and for a moment all his old fears fell quiet. He rode into the valley as the sun dipped low, the sky burning red behind him. The rider waited by the saloon in a half-dead town 2 miles east. When Silas arrived, their eyes met, an old bounty man from years ago. No words, just understanding. Both knew this had to end. The draw was fast. One shot split the silence. The bounty hunter dropped his gun and staggered back, not dead but beaten. Silas lowered his pistol, breath ragged. "No more," he said, voice shaking. "It ends here." By the time he returned to the cabin, night had fallen. Mary Lou was sitting on the porch, lantern beside her, waiting. When he dismounted, she ran to him, her hands trembling as she touched his face. He smiled faintly, weary but whole. He took the note from his pocket and handed it back to her, the edges worn. Then he wrote in the dirt beside her feet. "You were right." She knelt beside him, tracing another line beneath his words. "You're home now." The stars came out over them, endless and bright. The cabin creaked softly in the wind, the fire flickering inside. And for the first time, Silas Kane believed in peace, not the kind you find in a church or a grave, but the kind you build with someone who listens to your heart even when the world is silent. He reached for her hand. Together they sat watching the sky, the quiet wrapping around them like a promise that at last would be kept. The next morning began quiet, the kind of quiet that stretched wide over the valley and settled deep in the chest. The cabin door creaked open, and Silas stepped outside with the dawn. The air was cool, sweet with sage and dew. He stood for a long time, listening to a world that Mary Lou could not hear yet somehow understood better than anyone. She joined him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. The light caught her face, soft and sure, and when she looked up at him, the corners of her mouth lifted in a small, peaceful smile. They had made a life out of simplicity, mending, planting, riding into town only when they needed to. People had stopped calling her the Deaf Bride. In town she was just Mary Lou. They nodded to Silas now with quiet respect. No one dared mock either of them. But peace in the West was fragile. A letter came with a supply wagon one afternoon, sealed in red wax. Silas broke it open slowly. The words inside were few but heavy, an old debt, a name from his past, and a promise to collect. He folded the paper, slid it into his coat, and said nothing. Mary Lou saw the shadow return to his eyes. That night, as he cleaned his revolver by the fire, she wrote on a scrap of cloth, "You don't have to fight any more." He stared at her handwriting for a long time before shaking his head. Sometimes peace needs protecting. When the men came, they came at sundown, 3 riders, dust trailing behind like ghosts. The leader called out Silas's name, his voice cutting through the still air. Mary Lou stepped out onto the porch beside him. Her hand brushed his sleeve, steady and brave. Silas stepped forward. "You're not taking this place," he said. "Not her, not our life." The first shot split the silence. The horses reared, the air filled with smoke. Silas moved fast, the old instincts alive again, but sharpened by something new, purpose. 2 men fell, their guns scattering into the dirt. The third hesitated when he saw Mary Lou on the steps, her calm face framed by the fading light. Silas lowered his weapon. "Go home," he said quietly. "Tell whoever sent you it's finished." The man backed away, fear replacing hate, and rode off into the dark. When the dust cleared, Silas turned to Mary Lou. The look she gave him wasn't fear or anger, it was understanding. She walked to him, touched his cheek with trembling fingers, and smiled, the same small, sure smile that had carried them this far. They buried the past that night. No markers, no names, just the sound of wind and the glow of firelight on their faces. Silas took her hand, and for the first time he didn't feel like a gunslinger or a man running from ghosts. He felt like a man who had finally come home. The dawn broke clean and quiet over the ridge. Mary Lou stood at the doorway, the sunlight in her hair, and Silas watched her as if he were seeing the world for the first time. In that silence there was peace, not the kind born of fear or distance, but the kind built from love, forgiveness, and the courage to stay. Spring came gentle to the valley. The river ran clear again, the grass grew tall, and the cabin that once stood weathered and gray now looked like part of the land itself. Silas fixed the porch rail one morning while Mary Lou hung clean linens on the line. The wind caught the white cloth, and for a moment it looked like wings. She turned and smiled, her eyes bright with something unspoken. He wiped his hands, stepped closer, and took from his pocket a small folded paper. Inside was a ring, plain silver, the kind a man buys with his own sweat. He didn't kneel or make a speech. He just looked at her and mouthed, "If you'll have me." Mary Lou's breath caught. She reached out, took his hand, and nodded. Then slowly she traced words into his palm. "I already do. They married under the same sky that once saw her fall." No church, no preacher, just 2 souls and the sound of wind through the grass. Silas spoke his vow soft and low, the words trembling with truth. She answered by pressing his hand to her heart, letting him feel her promise in the beat beneath his palm. Afterward, they sat on the porch as the sun went down. The valley bathed in gold. Silas lit a small lantern and placed it between them. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think silence was a curse." Mary Lou smiled and wrote in her notebook, "Sometimes silence is where love speaks loudest." He read the words, his throat tight, and looked out toward the horizon. The same town that once laughed at her had sent a gift that morning, a basket of bread, flowers, and a letter signed by every name that once mocked her. The letter said only one thing: "Forgive us." She held it close, then let it fall into the fire. The paper curled and turned to ash, drifting upward like something set free. When night settled, Silas played the harmonica again. The notes carried softly over the hills. Mary Lou closed her eyes, her fingers resting on the wooden porch, feeling the faint hum of his song through the floorboards. It was the same tune he played the night by the river, only now it sounded like peace. As the last note faded, she reached for him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Together they watched the stars come alive, their light scattered across the sky like the promise of 1,000 tomorrows. In that quiet, the world felt whole again. The gunslinger who once sought redemption and the bride who could not hear now lived in the kind of silence that heals instead of hurts. And somewhere in the wind that crossed the valley it almost sounded like laughter, soft, gentle, and free. Winter drifted in quietly, wrapping the valley in silver light. Frost touched the fence post and the edges of the garden where summer's flowers once bloomed. Inside the cabin the fire burned slow and steady, its glow painting soft light across the walls. Silas sat by the window, whittling a small piece of wood into the shape of a bird. Mary Lou moved about the room, humming soundlessly, her movements graceful and sure. She paused beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. He turned, and she handed him a small folded page. On it were her words, written carefully in pencil. "Asterisk, you gave me back my voice, Silas. Not with sound, but with kindness." Asterisk, he smiled, rough and quiet, the kind of smile that comes from a man who finally learned peace. He took her hand, callous fingers closing over hers. "And you," he said softly, "gave me back my soul." The wind rose outside, brushing against the window like a whisper. The old church bell in Red Creek rang faintly in the distance, a sound neither of them could hear but both somehow felt. They went back to the town once, months later. The people met them with smiles this time, warm and true. Children ran past laughing, and the preacher shook Silas's hand. Mary Lou walked through the same doors where she had once fallen, the same aisle where the world had mocked her. This time she stood tall. The church was empty and still. She laid a single white flower on the altar, a quiet symbol of forgiveness. Silas stood behind her, his hat in hand. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She turned, their eyes meeting, and the world between them was full of meaning that words could never reach. As they left, the sky broke open in soft gold light. Dust rose from their boots, glowing in the sun. Silas looked out over the valley, where the town lay small and peaceful, and said, "They laughed once." I reckon they remember that day still. Mary Lou wrote a few words in her notebook, tore out the page, and handed it to him. Maybe laughter was what it took for them to learn silence. He read it slowly, nodded, and tucked the page into his coat. Then they walked on, side by side, toward the horses waiting near the gate. That evening, as they rode home, the horizon burned orange with the setting sun. The wind moved through the grass, soft as a prayer. Silas reached for her hand, and she smiled, eyes shining in the fading light. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The sound of the world around them, the wind, the earth, the quiet rhythm of life, was enough. And though the world will remember many stories of guns and courage, few would ever tell the one about the deaf bride and the gunslinger who found redemption in her silence. For in the end, it wasn't the noise of gunfire or the echo of laughter that lasted. It was the peace they built, steady and eternal, like the whisper of wind through the open plains. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the tales of the Old West alive. Leave a comment below and tell us what moment stayed with you most.